Manushi, welcome to the we're going to discuss an unusual topic. It may not appear very current, but I think it's of immense importance because it deals with the um, positioning of women, of a whole large community, global community of Indian origin. Though very few in India are aware of this connection, but I'm sure some of you certainly know about the Romani people who found all over Europe, and even North America and other parts of the world. It's an itinerant community which travels and it's on the move most of the time, like many of our own uh, traditional art performing communities. But let me not take a minute longer to talk about this community because we have with us two experts, um, Professor Ian Hancock. Welcome, Professor Hancock, and his very devoted student, Professor Dileep Karanth. We have posted a whole bibliography of Professor Hancock's books and a brief introduction to his work. He's a globally renowned academic and an activist as well. And you will see what an illustrious academic career he's had. And so also his student, Dileep Karanth. Without much ado, Professor Hancock, let me ask you a question that puzzles many Indians. The Romani people, why are they referred to as gypsies in Europe? And is it not a pejorative term or is it an acceptable normal term?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to say something about my people to your people, because we share our history with you. The word gypsy is quite an old word, and it comes from Egyptian. The word Egyptian was shortened in the Elizabethan period in England to Gypsian, which then got further shortened to Gypsy. And it wasn't just the English language that did that. There are words for us in other languages, Gitano in Spanish, for example, Gitan in French, all from Egyptian. And this was a mistake because when our ancestors arrived in the West, they gave us this name. They called us Egyptians. And stuck. We are not Egyptians. We are not from Egypt. And I can draw a parallel with referring to the Caribbean and to Native Americans as Indians. Another historical mistake that stuck. We don't like the word. First of all, it's historically inaccurate. As I say, we are not Egyptians. But secondly, our identity had been taken over by novelists, filmmakers, and so on. And so the general public perception is that we are defined by behavior rather than by ethnicity and history and culture. And so we do strive to get rid of that word gypsy. There are beautiful coffee table books of photographs of my people and gypsies in India. And the label in India for various nomadic peoples is the result of one British, I forget what his position was, some sort of commissioner back in the 1870s. His name was Ibbotson. And looking at the nomadic Indian tribes, he was reminded of the, quotes, gypsies in England, in his native England, and he applied that word. Now, that brings us to whether or not the people known as gypsies in India have anything to do with us. Well, in fact, some do. Most don't. But there are certain groups, Banjara in particular, who share our history. And I can go into more detail about that history if you wish.
Would you also consider the very broad-based community called Nuts, who were art performers, traditional art performers in India? Would they also not have some kind of a link with? Because in some ways they're very akin to Banjaras.
It's possible. It's quite clear now to us that we do not descend from one single people in India. Rather, that our ancestors were a composite population drawn from various ethno-linguistic peoples, conscripted into militia. So we have Rajputs at the top, Kshatriya, and so on, and the camp followers, the service providers to the armies, the Indian armies, of all social levels within India, speaking many different languages, related languages.
So why don't you take some time and switch off the instrument that's making all these weird sounds? Yeah. Yeah.
The population was drawn from a number of different groups from different social backgrounds to resist the incursions 1,000 years ago by Mahmud of Ghazni, Muhammad of Ghazni, who was extending his Ghaznavid empire into what today is northwestern India, Kashmir, Pakistan, Afghanistan, over a quarter of a century almost, and most of his forays were victories for him. And he took very many prisoners to use as gulams, which means slave soldiers, forced to fight for the captors. He took those people with him as a fighting force, along with the service providers, and that is important because the service providers included women. The militia were all male, but the service providers included women, and that's important historically, genealogically. But the Ghaznavids were defeated in turn by another Islamic force, the Seljuks. The Seljuks liberated the Indian captives, who were very happy to switch sides, if you like, to join the Seljuks, who then, during the 11th century, moved on and defeated the kingdom of Armenia, which brought that mixed Indian population to the eastern end of the Byzantine Empire, the Christian Empire. Once again, the the spread of Islam, this time with the Ottomans, moved into the Byzantine Empire and established the Ottoman Empire, which led to a push of the population up into southeastern Europe, the Balkans, and that's how we arrived in the West.
You mentioned women service providers. Do you mean sex slaves? Women who were
No,
captured as sex
no,
slaves?
absolutely not. Although perhaps some of them provided sex to the soldiers, but the service providers did many things. All armies traveled with service providers, camp followers, who sometimes outnumber the fighting force. Their job was to clear the battlefield, to set up the tents, to feed the soldiers, to tend to wounds, repair armor and weapons, cook, entertain, and so on. That was their purpose.
To the best of my knowledge, armies invariably carried men to provide those kind of services, supportive services, um, such as setting up tents, taking care of repair and wounded soldiers, or even cooking. Because Islamic historians have talked at length about capturing lakhs of women, Hindu women, including women of royal households that were defeated by Islamic invaders. They captured their women, royal family women, also as sex slaves. And the Mughals, for example, used to put them also in their own harems. You know, Akbar is reported to have had 3,000 women, sex slaves, in his harem. So I don't know. Anyway, we won't stick to that because that'll take us far away. Uh, so you're saying that's the time when these people, how did they reach Europe?
They reached Europe because they had established themselves in the Seljuk, the Sultanate of Rum, at the eastern end of the Byzantine Empire, where over time the mixed Indian population, now incorporating non-Indians, various other people, Persians, Kurdish people, Armenians. The best evidence of this journey out of India towards the West is in an examination of our language, the heart of which is clearly Indian. It's in fact very much historically like Urdu, more so than like Hindi, because the official military language was Persian, and Urdu has a lot of Persian in it, and so does Romani. There's a fair amount of Persian as well. So if we start from an Indian core, then we can add a layer of Dardic, possibly Burjasky, a few words, Persian, Kurdish, Armenian, got about 40 words from Armenian, very many words from medieval Greek, Byzantine Greek. And so we are beginning to crystallize into a population becoming a new ethnic population that was once a disparate group of people defined by profession, military profession. And as I say, as the Islamic world spread westwards, taking entirely the Byzantine Empire, moving up into Southeastern Europe, where we have hundreds of thousands of Romani people who are Muslims in that part of Europe. And that's how we got there. Now, when the Turks brought our ancestors into Europe, we don't know what their social status was. Were they already slaves before coming into Europe, or did they become slaves? My feeling is that slavery became a condition because they arrived at a time where in the Balkans there was great need for artisan skills. The wars between the Christian world and the Islamic world had depleted the manpower, and there was a need for skilled workers, and the Romanis arrived with skills that the Europeans didn't have, especially in metalwork, in building work, and so on. And the demands being placed upon them became excessive, and so they continued to move on out into the rest of Europe, which led the Wallachians and Moldavians to institute new laws making the Romani workers property, in other words, slaves. And that slavery lasted until the middle of the 19th century. And after the abolition of slavery at that time, many of the ex-slaves tried to get out of this new country of Romania. Some moved into Russia, some moved in the other direction into Serbia and Hungary and so on. And some of those continued on to North and South America as well. So we are a global people, not simply a European people, but it is Europe more than in the Americas that we are having to endure quite harsh discrimination. Our enslavement doesn't get into the school books. Very little is known about our genocide in Nazi Germany. We lost the same proportion of our people as the Jews did. We have received very little in the way of remuneration, compensation for our losses. When our people were captured, they had all of their wealth, and we traditionally tend to carry our wealth on our bodies, on our clothing. All of that was stolen, taken, the gold, even gold from teeth, was taken by the Nazis, never returned. And so this is something we're still dealing with.
So your estimate is that as many Romanis were slaughtered or put to death by Hitler as Jews? Is that what you say?
Not in whole numbers, because there were far fewer of us. But in terms, and we're talking about genocide, the destruction of peoples. So in terms of percentage, then, and again, it depends. Are we talking about only in Nazi-controlled Europe or globally? But in Nazi-controlled Europe, then we lost about the same percentage as did the Jewish people.
that history has not been documented well. Is that your um, assertion?
It's not being documented enough. It's beginning to be documented well. There is resistance to it. Um, but uh, we have a saying that you can hide your grandmother in the cupboard, but you cannot prevent her from coughing loudly and revealing herself. And this is slowly happening. People are learning about this as well. But one of the problems is that, and this has been stated by a couple of historians, it could be that people simply don't care about the Romani genocide. We are traditionally seen as the eternal outsiders, and this is something I wanted to expand upon today. The original title of this presentation maintained that the discrimination rests upon our Indian ancestry, and to a large extent that is quite true, but it's not the only reason. I could summarize the various reasons and expand upon any of them if you wish. The first reason was that we were associated wrongly with the Islamic incursion into the Christian world. Europe already had experience of this because the Moorish people had moved up into Iberia, into Spain, and now in southeastern Europe we have the Ottomans coming in and establishing an empire which lasted until the beginning of the First World War. And so not only was this a threat to the Christian establishment, but also an economic problem, because the trade routes to the east were now blocked off.
May I just request Bhavu to please bring you full on screen? I want the viewers to be able to see you in full. I am not comfortable with this narrow band showing you. Bhavu, can you make us small, which is what we do normally? While the speaker is speaking, let him be on the whole screen. Just give a minute. I'm sorry for this. Um, yeah, not me on the screen. Uh, yes, this is better. But if you can have Professor Hancock on full screen while he's not me, him.
Let him speak, ma'am.
Okay, so at least bring him in bigger format, not the very small format we had. It's chalo. Let's start. I'm sorry about these glitches, but then as I said, our main technical person is not available today. Chalo, Bhavak, bring him on as big as you can. Okay, at least this much. Hmm.
Yes, the various
Oh. All right, fix it to the best of your ability, Bhavak.
Ma'am, I
You
think
can go off
when
screen.
he will start speaking, no, he'll come
Huh.
automatically on top.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let's have you start. Oh,
the um, the reasons for the discrimination are several, somewhat complex, and as I say, the earliest was the association, uh, wrongly, of us with the Islamic into the Christian world. I mentioned that this was not just religious, and another religion-related factor was access to the Holy Land was now blocked, as well as access to the trade routes to the east. So there was that. Secondly, our ancestors were the first people of color in any large number to come into the Western world. And Christian doctrine associates darkness with sin and lightness with purity. And because the churches were one of the few places that actually kept written records, most people didn't read and write, but churches kept written records and were the earliest places to document the arrival of early Romanis in Europe, and they would refer to the physical appearance, the dark skins and so on. So there was that. The fact that we have never had a country or an army or an economy or a government, so we don't belong to any European country or any country anywhere, which, and I'll come back to this later, which changed a great deal when India came into the picture some years ago, but I'll come back to that. Another reason for the discrimination does have to do with the core culture, which is called Romani Pen.
Could you repeat that word?
Romani Pen. It is the pen is the ending, which in Sanskrit would be Bahan, Bahana, something like that. It makes a noun. So it's Romani-ness. Grammatically, that's what the word is. But central to our worldview is the notion of two kinds of uncleanliness. And we have different words for this. If you are dirty with dirt, so that you can wash yourself with soap and water and get clean, this would be melalo. Mel is dirt, or chikalo, chik is something like mud. But
Same as in Hindi. Mel.
yes, yes. But on the other hand, you could be spiritually unclean. And there are different words for this, but makardi comes from the verb mak. Mak means to smear something or to stain something. And if you are spiritually unclean, then that's a whole different situation. And we, in conservative Romani culture, non-Romani people that we call gaje are not spiritually clean. It's not an inherited condition. It is a condition resulting from the way they live or the way that we perceive them to live. Because if a non-Romani girl marries a Romani boy, and when a boy becomes married at whatever age, he becomes a man, and the word for him changes. And if a Romani girl gets married, she becomes a woman, whatever age. Um, the but if it's a non-Romani bride, Bori, then she would have to learn to cook and wash and do various things according to Romani faith, and she would not be Magadhi anymore. So it's not because they are Gaje, it's because their culture is different. So this has had deep repercussions because it means that for some groups more than others, the children are not sent to schools because they have to sit next to non-Romani boys and girls. They would have to eat food cooked by non-Romani cooks in the canteen, in the cafeteria. And they would learn things which are in direct contradiction to Romani values and beliefs. And so this has created a barrier between Romani people and Gaje, which leads automatically to suspicion. And I've made many times a parallel with anti-Semitism, because conservative Jewish culture is very similar in that food must be prepared in a certain way. Non-Jewish people are kept at arm's length, and as long as any group keeps outsiders outside, then they are inviting suspicion and scapegoating and so on. So this is yet another factor in the discrimination over years, over centuries, directed at my people.
May I intervene for a minute, or would you rather continue first?
Please intervene.
Now, you say that any group that wants to keep its exclusive value system alive and therefore has this boundary around it, and wants to bring up its children its own way, is suspect. But the fact is, Europeans, no matter where they went, they created exclusive colonies. They did not really allow entry to others. They continued speaking. The British may have lived here for 200 years, but they continued speaking English. They did not adopt any of the Indian languages for their day to day communication or even administration. So, this suspicion, I think, perhaps is a lot more to do with racial profiling and you're being non-Christian, because anybody who's racially different in Europe is already suspect. Skin color different, hideously suspect. Then third, being proud of your own tradition. Then they have to crush you. If you don't appear before them for approval, then you're not acceptable at all. So, to my mind, I don't think this could have been, because you were not aggressive. It's not as if Romanis were aggressive against others while trying to retain their own culture. Am I right?
You're absolutely right. It has to do with control of identity, and one of the repercussions, this is a better word than that, but one of the effects of our not going into the non-Romani world and the schools has been that we are largely an illiterate population, older people especially, but over time, pretty universally the fact. So when the at the time of the Enlightenment, there were new sciences were emerging. Religion was being questioned. Western European colonization around the world was happening, and Westerners were encountering so many new things, new kinds of people, new languages, new cultures, new religions, new animals, new plants, which led to categorizing everything. Sciences, zoology, botany, linguistics all started to happen around this time, and it became obvious, predictable, that human groups would start to be ranked and classified and categorized as well. And since Western scholars were doing this, of course, Western people were at the top of the list, and it was fascinating for those early people, those early scholars, to realize that in the heart of their white world were these people who obviously were not white, were not European. And this came at a time.
And we're not Christian. So it's to do with monotheistic racism.
Yes.
Not just racial, but also monotheism.
That is right. And I could talk a bit later about how much Indian we still maintain, rather a lot after 1,000 years, which is remarkable. So what was happening was that scientific studies were being published about who and what we were, and the breakthrough came in 1760. Now, I should say that part of the problem also was that we forgot the circumstances of our own history. And that's partly, I think, because we came together as a people on the doorstep of Europe in the Byzantine Empire. So when Romanis were asked, "Who are you? Where are you from?" We were not able to say, except to say which country we had just come from. That's one reason why one of the wrong words applied to us is Bohemians, because and this I think happened in France. Where are you people from? Bohemia. So we're Bohemians. So the breakthrough came when a Hungarian student from the Austro-Hungarian Empire was attending a Dutch university, at Leiden, University of Leiden, and that university had an exchange program with an Indian university, whereby 3 Dutch students would do their postgrad work in India, and 3 Indian students would come to the Netherlands to do their postgrad work at the University of Leiden. Now, this Hungarian, whose name was Stefan Valle, came from a wealthy family that employed a lot of Romani laborers, and he would spend time with them, and he picked up quite a bit of our language. And on this one occasion, he was we could imagine the student union room, and he sat with these 3 Indians, and he was listening to their conversation, and he recognized the words they were using in their language. And he thought these words are very much like the Romani words that he picked up back home. So he asked these students for a list of Indian words with their, I suppose, Hungarian equivalents or maybe Dutch equivalents. We never found the list. He took it back with him, sat down with those Romanis, and they matched up so many of those words. He passed that information on to somebody else. It didn't get published until 1776. Once it appeared in a newspaper, a gazette, the scholars picked it up. Look at this, these Zigoina, which is another outside word for us, a word we really don't like at all. These Zigoina come from India, the mystery solved. They speak an Indian language, therefore they must be from India. We know, of course, that is a very dangerous assumption to make. But that's what they believed. So the next quest was to say, well, if they are Indians, what are they doing here? Who are they? Do they have a country back there? And sometime later, a German scholar wrote that since these Zigoina do very menial jobs, and many of them are musicians, they must come from the Shudra caste, the lowest caste, because Shudra people in India do the same kind of menial jobs.
Not quite. I mean, that's a very crude distortion brought in by Orientalists. But
Yes, of
I
course.
mean,
Remember,
it'll take us another 100 years to cleanse their mind of all this nonsense.
yes, the caste system has been horribly mutilated by.
No, we didn't have caste system. We had a jati vyavastha,
Yes,
which is very different from caste system.
but remember, this was somebody, an avowed racist, remember, writing 200 years ago or more.
Yeah.
And then another scholar, another German, said, well, the Zigoiners' name for themselves is Rom, and the people in India call themselves Dom or Domba, and this clinches it. Obviously, they call themselves by the same name. It took a very long time before a number of us who speak Romani, who are academics, began to re-examine our history and to show how absolutely wrong the conventional wisdom was. So, coming back to the period of the Enlightenment, it became very necessary for the Europeans to save us and to Christianize us. And so missionaries who were being sent to the tropics around the world were now also going into what they were calling gypsy camps in England and elsewhere to Christianize and save our people. At the same time, another factor was the internal combustion engine, scientific development that led to industrialization and the creation of a working class and the exploitation of children going down coal mines, of alcoholism, of prostitution, of horrible times that Charles Dickens wrote about graphically in his works. The pre-industrial times became romanticized. They were clean, they were rural, they were agricultural, and Victorian art and poetry reflects this. Farms and shepherdesses and meadows and mill streams and so on. And representing this in the imagination were these children of nature, these gypsies, unaffected by industrialization, living out in the country, living in wagons with horses, catching rabbits to eat, singing and dancing all the time. A very unreal picture, but and a highly romanticized picture that got into storybooks and later on film and song. And so our identity got refashioned in literature, and this is what people think of now, especially here in the United States where I live now. The average American, more than the average European, tends to think that gypsy is a behavior and not an actual people. And it's a very hard thing to dispel, because if we cannot be taken seriously, then our problems cannot be taken seriously. I was recently in Washington, D.C. with a group of Romani leaders. We were protesting the fact that Ukraine's neighboring nations, Moldavia, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, are not letting Romanis out of Ukraine. They don't want them, they're forcing them back into that country. This is just the latest example of racism against my people.
May I interrupt you with a couple of points?
Yeah.
One of the first questions that arose in my mind when you talked about how your people were taken as slaves by Islamic invaders going back from India,
Yes.
and then you ended up in Europe through that route. How come your people escaped conversion? Because elsewhere, the Islamists made sure that people they took as slaves converted. The only place they failed to convert 100% is India, which is why they hate us with fury.
Well, although the Ottomans were at the top of the hierarchy, if you like, they allowed the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia to be Christian. And so the slaves in Romania were slaves of the churches and of the noble men, the boyars,
Okay.
not of Muslims.
Okay, I get it. Now, my second question is, what is the total number of your community globally? Do you have any estimates? Are they taken into account during census operations in different countries?
Well, very many Romani people will not respond to censuses, and national estimates greatly underestimate the number. A safe estimate is between 12 and 14 million globally. There are those who put it much higher than that. Part of the problem is what actually is a Romani person, because simply having an ancestor who was Romani does not make you Romani automatically. And since these DNA tests have become very popular, I get emails all the time from people who get their DNA tests back and find a little minuscule trace of Romani, and they suddenly have become Romanis because it's an attractive, romantic identity to assume. But the fact is, if you're Romani, you must have been born into a Romani family, be recognized by other Romanis as Romani, part of an ongoing community that you interact with all the time. Ideally, you speak the language and maintain aspects of the culture. So saying that certain people are Romani, for example, some years ago, somebody found a Scottish Romani ancestor for President Clinton, which he had no idea about. And so there were newspaper articles about President Clinton being a gypsy, and that's why he could play a saxophone so well. That association of us as singing and dancing, carefree, it all feeds into the stereotype. Another one of which is that we love to wander. And I hate that word, wander, and roam. Some people have maintained that we are called Romanis because we roam, we're Romanis. The sad fact is we have had to move from place to place because we were being forced to do so. Another stereotype is the fortune telling. Well, fortune telling, especially here in North and South America, is a major source of income. But attitudes towards it differ greatly in Asia and in the West. For us, we don't call it fortune telling. That's the English translation. We call it drabarimos. It comes from the word drab, which means medicine, and verb drabar means to heal. And so drabaribed, drabarimos means healing. And so fortune tellers, as the English has it, are healing people's problems, often to do with health, money, sex, curses, and what have you. And supposedly we can apply curses. If we really could, we would have cursed Hitler and the slavers and so on. It's all part of the stereotype. Now, fortune telling is a well-respected profession in Asia.
But it's not called fortune telling. It's called astrology.
Yes.
And it's Jyotishacharya is a well-reputed science. It requires deep knowledge of cosmic movements and how they affect the planet. It's not fortune telling in terms of, just guesswork and aura.
This is how when we speak English, we call it reading and advising. We don't call it fortune telling. It's regarded with skepticism in the West. Nevertheless, Western newspapers have their astrological charts, and kings and queens and presidents have their astrologers in the West. But at a time when people were being moved on at a moment's notice by police, by soldiers, and had to leave heavy equipment, anvils and so on. Fortune telling, in English terms, does not require heavy equipment. It doesn't require any equipment. If you read Hobbes, a deck of cards is easily picked up and run with. So it is a source of income that is movable. In other places, of course, during slavery time, the slaves were not going anywhere, and so they were able to have their forges and so on, which were fixed.
I'd like to here point out, in the case of Europe, you're indicating that they were being constantly forced to move by the police and by the authorities, and therefore they had to continue their itinerant lifestyle. By contrast, in India, be it Banjaras or the Nut community, the various traditional art performers that come under the broad rubric of Nut community,
Yes.
it's also an all India community, actually spread all over the subcontinent. The British were extremely reluctant to let them continue moving because they acted as the social media of those towns. They were the ones who could carry messages. They were the ones who carried messages of disturbances and revolts and what else. So the British took great deal of hostility to their movements and forced them to settle down through very harsh means, literally setting up concentration little camps because they're not such a big population, and declared them a criminal tribe in the way perhaps Europe also treated those they designated as gypsies as criminal tribe. Am I right?
Yes,
But here for the opposite reason.
it's the opposite, yes. And at the same time, uh, from the very beginning, the Romanis were accused of being spies because they were moving from place to place, but they really had no choice but to move from place to place. I do take issue with referring to that as a lifestyle. It's not even a culture, it's a way of life imposed. Um, and in places where there's a level playing field, where there isn't that discriminatory pressure, Romani culture is beautiful culture. First of all, it's extremely family oriented. The family comes first. Um, the culture is maintained particularly by the Glomnia, the Romani women. Um, the language is maintained uh, within the home. Uh, and perhaps I could give some examples for people watching just how similar the language is. Of course, the Indian element in the language, apart from much of the grammar, uh, is from an earlier time. We have to go back 1,000 years. We don't have Indian words for computer or astroturf. But if I count up to 5 for you, I would say Yek, Dui, Three, Start, Punch, Nak, Chip, Bal, Ka, Yak.
Oh,
These are all basic words. Dan, was,
oh,
yeah. It's surprisingly retentive. Um, after all this time, with no country until the past century, really no written language. The only people that wrote it down were non-Romani scholars who were interested in our language. Um, but all the basic stuff, mani is water, mol is wine, pi is drink, ka is eat. Just so many. Baro is big. But then there are words from these other languages as well. So our word for luck is bacht, which
Yes.
bacht, a Persian word, I believe.
Hmm. There's a very interesting comment I noticed, I think, which will be of interest to you. Somebody who names himself as Enchanting says, "My father has done a huge lot of work on Romas. He's the only one in whole of Asia who can speak with the Gypsies in their own language. He was made the vice president of the Romas." I don't know what the real name of this person is, but Enchanting, please send me an email with details. I'd love to talk to your father and maybe have a common dialogue between Professor Hancock and your father. That would be nice if somebody's really done work on Asian Romas. But coming back to you, Professor Hancock, I just thought you'd be interested in that comment. Um, what proportion of youngsters among Romas want to continue with the old traditional bonds, the family as an institution, the manner in which it is perpetuated, and all that, because it takes a lot of discipline to stay within. You can't be as wayward as the Western youngsters are. Me, mine, and the rest of the world can go to hell. And the tendency to move away from the family after you're a teenager, I mean, after 18, nobody wants to stay with their parents. Whereas if you have to keep the family bonded together, then no matter how old you are, your parents are with you. You don't wish to break free of them. You want to stay bonded to them, and more so as you grow older. What is it like among the youth of your community?
It depends very much on which group we are talking about, because some groups are far more conservative than others. Those who had been kept in slavery for 5.5 centuries are more conservative generally. Groups such as the Sinti Romanis are pretty conservative, but there are other groups which have, to an extent, been, if I can make the word, de-ethnicized. It's
Devacidated.
yes. It depends upon that. In places where the persecution is pretty intense, Slovakia, Czech Republic in the past, and now also Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, if you are fair-skinned, if you are light-skinned like I am, you can deny what you are. But if you are dark-skinned, then whether you maintain a Romani identity or not, even if you don't, you are still singled out as a non-white person, as a person of color. So there would still be discrimination. This has happened in Spain and in Hungary in particular, where in the past it was outlawed to speak the language, to dress in Romani clothing, um, and to call yourself Romani. Um, and so the language for in Spain, it disappeared altogether. What's spoken there is Spanish with a scattering of Romani words mixed in. In Hungary, huge numbers of the Romani population just lost the language. They are native speakers of Hungarian, but they are still identified as Tsigan because of appearance very often, because of family name, because of where they live, the jobs they do. So they are still identified as, quotes, gypsies. As to the people, the youngsters who want to stay what they are, and there's an increasing number, because there is also an increasing number of educated young people. When we know more about who we are, where we come from, we have a better handle on where we're going. And that's very important. We know who we are, we know the law, we know that we are protected by the same laws as any other citizen. That's coming slowly, but it's coming. And the non-Romani world is not seen as an attractive place. The Gaje are the ones who make wars. They are the ones who create pornographic websites, and when they come in for a reading to a Dramani, they bring in with them an unattractive picture of the world they've come from. I said earlier today, the problems that people come in looking for a reading have to do with illness, lack of money, love, problems, a horrible life. Of course, they are not representative of the entire non-Romani world by any means, but this is what comes in to the Romani world. And then when the kids watch TV and they watch these sitcoms, they get some very contrary examples of non-Romani standards. I'll give you one or two. It's seen as funny for children to be rude to their parents in TV shows. A child will say something rude to his mother or father, and then there is the automatic laugh track, which comes right after it, which subliminally says this is okay, this is a positive thing. And then children copy that. You find the relationship between dogs and cats and families, where dogs are sleeping on the same beds with their owners. This would be absolutely forbidden in Romani culture, because dogs and cats are unclean. On the other hand, horses are clean, and it has to do with personal grooming of these different animals.
Let us now bring in Dileep Karanth, who's been listening to this conversation. He's worked with you. He's obviously got this cross-cultural perspective as well. So, Dileep, what would you say to this? Listening to Professor Hancock, what struck me was the fact that The Europeans have this tendency not to allow people's identity to be self defined. Like, we're called Hindus, that is not a term we use for ourselves. Um, and similarly, Indians, that's not what we called ourselves. They gave us caste, that is not our identity. They tried to erase our own self defined identities. In the case of Romanis, also, there's so many names that have been given to them. Um, so that you grow up confused, who am I? And you are what mirror they hold for you, and what they want you to see in that mirror is what you're supposed to be looking like, behaving like. What are the commonalities you see between the plight of Hindus in a way? This is a question being repeatedly and more loudly and more fiercely asked. Allow us to define ourselves. We don't want to accept the names you've given us. What do you say to that? And what have you learned that is so valuable to you from Professor Hancock?
Yes, so when I first became his student, um, this is exactly the thought that ran in my head. And I was very happy to discover that Professor Hancock, and he very quickly asked me to call him Ian and allowed me to be a friend rather than just a student. And he was willing to listen to what I had to say. And at that time, I was a young and perhaps a more brash young man. And I expressed my points of view more contrariously. But he was still willing to listen to me. And over time, I realized that he does like people to be who they are. He doesn't. He prefers that people speak for themselves. And so he's very passionate about letting people be who they are. And so that was one of the reasons I was very attracted to his work. He's also willing to change his opinions, and he's also willing to listen to a reasonable argument, even from a much younger man such as myself. And so when I felt very honored to be asked to edit a collection of his essays, and he was always willing to listen to me, to my opinion about any Indian words. And I have a certain knowledge of Sanskrit, not by any means a specialist at it, but more than a layman's knowledge of it. And I also have taught Hindi briefly, so I have a good academic knowledge of Hindi. And I found Ian was willing to listen to me about, in matters of etymology, he always asks me for my opinion. So I find him willing to learn from experts and from youngsters and from lay people. So I think he's the best person to speak about the Romani people, because he knows his roots. He has seen through all the different ways in which people deny themselves, and all the different ways in which people's cultures are defined for them. So, and I was most anxious that a Romani scholar himself speak to an Indian viewership directly without any other intermediary. So I'm not sure.
Coming back to you, Professor Hancock, since Dileep wants you to speak, be the main voice for Romanis people. Let me get back to you, and I would like you to give me a little bit of your own history. How did you grow up to be who you are, a global celebrity? Are you still seen as part of your community, or are you seen as just too far up there in the clouds for the ordinary Romanis to say, yes, he's one of us?
That's a very good point, because, of course, as an academic, I am socially distant from the vast majority of the Romani population, but I'm by no means alone. I'm by no means unique. The number of professional Romani people is growing pretty rapidly, and I interact at that level mostly these days because of COVID, electronically, but previously I would be over in Europe every year at different meetings, sometimes academic meetings about us, which I tend to stay away from, because we have become an industry for a certain kind of scholar, mostly for organizations made up of our own people, just to be with our own people. On the other hand, I live in a town where there are very many Romani people of various subgroups. They don't interact with each other to a great extent, but that's pretty typical. But we are together all the time. In fact, a couple of days ago, I hosted a dinner for a family, a Romani family from Romania that had come to live in the United States 5 years ago in Chicago. The daughter is an exceptional young 21-year-old, a gifted concert pianist, and also because I'm here in Austin, Texas, the parents got her enrolled at the University of Texas. I'm immensely proud about this. And so they actually moved from Chicago, drove all the way down to Texas. I helped them move in, and I took them out to eat, along with some of the local Romani people, to introduce them to each other. And that was just a couple of days ago. And as I mentioned a while ago too, a number of us were in Washington, D.C. to protest the situation in Ukraine. At the same time, we protested at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum because we are grossly underrepresented in that museum, which was created to emphasize genocide. This in the mission statement.
Professor Hancock,
Yes.
Since we're running out of time, I'd like you to conclude this session with two questions, two answers to my questions. And then my request to you will be to have a special session a few weeks later on the specific forms of discrimination and persecution faced by Romanis in the West. If that's okay with you, I'd like to have a follow-up conversation. Now, my two questions are, and they're coming from our audience actually. Firstly, are the Romanis people really interested in reconnecting with their Hindu ancestors, with the culture and the dharmic traditions of India? There's a lot in common, no doubt, but are they interested? or they think India is the backwaters of civilization. So why do we want to go back? Better to stay connected with Europe. And if they are interested, or you are interested, let's say you can only speak for yourself, what is it that you would like the Indian people or the Indian government to do to facilitate this connection?
Are those both questions?
Yes,
Again, it depends who you are asking.
I'm asking you.
Well, let me rephrase it. I cannot answer for everybody, but there are people like myself who are very much committed to emphasizing our Indian roots. It was, after all, the Indian government that funded, that supported, along with the World Council of Churches, our first World Romani Congress in 1971. Madam Gandhi recognized us as an Indian people in diaspora. Evidently, it would not be difficult for Romani people to take out Indian citizenship, which is, as I understand it, not all that easy for foreigners, but being part of the diaspora. I am the Romani representative in an organization called GOPIO, that stands for Global Organization of People of Indian Origin. It's worth forwarding that organization up. So yes, we have Romani Ker means house. It's like Gar. In Chandigarh, it has been taken over by its founder, Padma Shri Rishi, Veer Rishi. His son in England continues his work. I have been there. I was in Dharamsala at the invitation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who advised us as a people to keep the customs that are strengthening and to lose those which serve no purpose anymore, if we are to survive. And I thought that was pretty sound advice. So yes, India is the country that we can identify with rather than any other country on the planet. The one country where half of our population spent most of its Western experience, of course, is Romania, but we have no desire whatsoever to identify with a country that made us slaves. So yes, India is very important to us. Now there are other Romani activists who say that's all very well, it's interesting historically, but we are now a Western people. We really have only existed in the West as an identifiable group. We were a mixed population before entering the West, and it serves no practical purpose. I disagree because we can explain much of what we do by knowing where we come from. One simple example that I give when I speak to Indian American groups is the Loli Dori, which I believe sound the same in India. Loli Dori is a red thread.
Yeah.
It's put around the wrist of a small child. A wedding, we call bial. I think that's almost the same word that you have. So much is the same, and we kept it. We have even a kind of wrestling with men wrestle with oil on their bodies, pilimani, Um, you still find that in some communities. Sapengre, the snake charmers, we call sap is a snake. You find this um, not not eating foods grown below the ground at certain times. Um, this is Indian. Uh, cannot have potatoes or onions and so on at certain times for certain feasts. The internal legal system, the legal tribunal, which we call a kris, is the same as the uh,
Panchayat.
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 Yeah, we have that also. Um, there are so many parallels which are still there, and one could easily argue, well, that's very interesting. Easter really is a pre-Christian thing. That's very interesting, and it's nothing more than that. But I disagree because it helps us know more about ourselves.
Okay. That's interesting, and I hope at least more active links will come about as a result of the availability of the internet. Communication online has become so easy. It wasn't so easy to know, to talk, to understand face to face. One last comment that came from one of our viewers who said that Beethoven and Bach, these great classical musicians of Europe, are supposed to have been deeply influenced by Romani's musicians who used to play on the streets of Europe. Is that true? In that case, he says, oh, of course, this viewer was trying to stretch the point further by saying, which means Western classical music is also influenced by Indian classical music. We don't need to go that far. But is it true that these two great classical musicians acknowledged their debt, or were they aware that they were influenced, or is there any truth in this point at all?
Some musicians have done that. There's been a considerable amount of work on the Indian element in flamenco music.
Yes.
Particularly the finger cymbals, which became castanets.
Yes.
And there are dance styles actually in the south of India now, but evidently all over India at an earlier time. So yes, that has been acknowledged, certainly. There is a voice style which is like the Indian bowl style, where you don't sing with words but simply with sounds. That where you were forbidden to use instruments, your voice would become an instrument. There are parallels there. And when I taught my course, I would play our music, which differs from place to place considerably. But I would then play an Indian piece demonstrating the similarities.
That's interesting. Well, so if you are willing, we'll have another session a couple of weeks or maybe a month later, dealing with the very specific forms of discriminations and persecutions suffered by the Romanese people. If it's okay with you, I'll get in touch with you and we'll fix a mutually convenient date. It's been a pleasure listening to you. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you, Dileep, for acting as a go-between. I'm so happy you persevered.
It's a privilege.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay, viewers, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. A lot of new things to learn, even for those of us who knew a little bit about the Romanese people. और मेरी आप सबसे एक छोटी सी रिक्वेस्ट, और आमिया आपको तो खास कर, जिस दिन जो डिस्कशन हो रही हो कृपया उसी पे कमेंट कीजिए। ये नहीं कि आप अपने किसी और डिस्कशन को लेके आके यहाँ पे शुरू कर दो। ये किसी भी स्पीकर के लिए बहुत डिसोरिएंटिंग होता है कि आप उसकी बात की बजाय आप अपने ही राग अलाप रहे हैं। तो व्यूअर्स प्लीज इतना तो डिसिप्लिन ऑब्जर्व कीजिए। और माइक शेट में आपका कमेंट ये आ रहा है कि मैं जाति सिस्टम को डिफेंड करती हूँ, जैसे बहुत इगैलिटेरियन था वगैरह वगैरह वगैरह। और मेरा ये कहना कि ब्रिट्स ने अनटचेबिलिटी हम पे डाली है। नो, लेट मी मेक माई पोजिशन वेरी क्लियर। नंबर 1, दुनिया में कोई समाज किसी वक्त का, इंक्लूडिंग द मोस्ट सो कॉल्ड एडवांस डेमोक्रेसीज which swear by equality, tell me if they are perfect egalitarian. मुझे ये बताइए, जो कोई अमेरिकन कॉर्पोरेट हॉन्चो या कोई आईवी लीग का प्रोफेसर, उसकी बेटी का भी आपने देखा है कि किसी सड़क का कूड़ा बिनने वाले जो होते हैं, अमेरिका में भी होते हैं ना, गार्बेज क्लीनर्स, उसके साथ शादी कर ले? नहीं होता। कोई परफेक्ट इगैलिटेरियन सोसाइटी नहीं। और मैं तो मानती हूँ कि जितनी अनइगैलिटेरियन अमेरिकन सोसाइटी है, जिसको हॉलमार्क समझा जाता है इक्वालिटी का, मुझे नहीं लगता दुनिया में कोई है। जहां भी जाते हैं तहस नहस मचा देते हैं, दुनिया के चौकीदार बन के बैठे हुए। किसने कहा उन्हें? किसी ने नहीं कहा। तू कौन, मैं खामखा। उनको हर जगह अपनी टांग अड़ानी है, उनको हर जगह अपना पॉलिटिकल सिस्टम इम्पोज करना है, डेमोक्रेसी के नाम पे दुनिया को तहस नहस करना है। वो हमने बहुत देख लिया। इसलिए मुझे वेस्टर्न किसी भी डेमोक्रेसी से कुछ नहीं आप सीखने का मन, कुछ भी नहीं सीखने का मन। कचरा पढ़ाते हो हमारे दिमाग में, कचरा भूसा भर देते हैं। और हमको जिस प्रिज्म से देखते हैं, उस प्रिज्म से, उस शीशे में तो मुझे शक्ल देखनी है, उस शीशे को मैं बहुत पहले तोड़ चुकी हूँ। ये कौन सा समाज है जहां परफेक्ट इगैलिटेरियनिज्म होती है? अगर मैं छोटा 5 फुट साइज की हूं, मैं क्या 6 फुट के साथ बराबरी हर चीज में कर सकती हूँ? नहीं। मैं बास्केटबॉल में उसकी बराबरी कर सकती हूँ? नहीं। बहुत चीजों में नहीं कर सकती, कहीं और कर सकती हूँ। दूसरा, टैलेंट, स्किल पूल्स, ये सभी बराबर होते। पैदाइशी एक ही घर में बच्चे बराबर नहीं होते। बराबर मीनिंग आइडेंटिकल नहीं होते। हर एक के स्किल सेट्स डिफरेंट होते। ये जो इगैलिटेरियनिज्म है विच डिमांड्स बीइंग आइडेंटिकल ऑलमोस्ट, ये कहीं भी नहीं होती है। इसलिए वो तो मुझे मत सिखाइए। और जहां तक अनटचेबिलिटी का सवाल है, इट कैन बी इजीली प्रूवन। बहुत सी जातियां जिनको स्केड्यूल कास्ट में धकेला गया, या जिनको भंगी कहा गया। भंगी किनको कहा गया? जिनको इस्लामियों ने स्लेव बना के, उनका धर्म भंग करके, उनके जनेऊ भंग करवाए, तुड़वाए, और भंगी बन गए। वो भंगी बन गए और वो काम कराए, मैला उठाने के और गंदे काम, जो समाज में, हमारे समाज में नहीं भी हो रहे थे। सो द पॉइंट दैट आई एम ट्राइंग टू मेक इज अनटचेबिलिटी तो नहीं थी। हाँ, हाइजीन के बहुत कड़े कानून थे और होने भी चाहिए। हाइजीन के लिहाज से अगर आप ये करते हैं कि हर जगह बैठ के खाना नहीं खाएंगे, आप वही खाना खाएंगे जहां आपको मालूम है कि जिस हाइजीन के आप आदी हैं वही आपको मिलेगी, इसमें कोई बुराई नहीं है। हम नहीं पीते पानी हर जगह। ये सिर्फ ये नहीं कि इस कास्ट को देख के उसको बहुत से आज के तथाकथित ब्राह्मण घर हैं जहाँ की हाइजीन ऐसी नहीं है कि मैं वहां का पानी पी लूं। हाइजीन की बात हम कर रहे हैं। जो बहुत मैला काम करवाते हैं, जिससे भी उसके साथ थोड़ा डिस्टेंस रखना ही पड़ता, आज भी रखना पड़ता है उन सब लोगों के साथ जो उस वक्त के लिए, पर ये नहीं कि वो परमानेंटली अनटचेबल हो गए। और अगर आप देखें हमारे रामायण में बताइए कौन अछूत है, कोई दिखा आपको? बहुत सी जो आज की SC ST कम्युनिटीज हैं, वो तो उनसे तो गले मिलते हैं राम। आपने देखा होगा निषाद राजा, ये वो, किसी के साथ आपने रामायण में अनटचेबिलिटी होते देखी? या कहाँ है हमारे वेदों में या शास्त्रों में अनटचेबिलिटी की बात? बट सब बराबर रहे हो, दुनिया में कहीं रहे हो, मुझे एक समाज बता दीजिए, और वो समाज जो अभी हाल तक भी स्लेवरी के ऊपर अपनी वेल्थ जनरेट किए हैं, लूट प्लंडर और स्लेव बना के जिन्होंने अपनी सारी वेल्थ जनरेट की है, ह्यूमन ट्रैफिकिंग की है जो वेस्ट ने की है, वो हमें सिखाएंगे इगैलिटेरियनिज्म? माफ कीजिए, नहीं सीखनी। जो भी हमने सीखना है, अब अंदर झांक के पहले तो सीखना है हम थे कौन और बन क्या गए हैं। सो प्लीज डोंट थिंक दैट आई एम एन apologist who believes that all was perfect. Perfection is known only in fiction. हमारे तो देवी देवता भी परफेक्ट नहीं होते। क्या कहते हैं, 32 कला संपूर्ण भगवान कृष्ण भी परफेक्ट नहीं थे, और हम ढूंढते भी नहीं है परफेक्शन, और इसीलिए हमें किसी देवी देवता की गुलामी भी नहीं करनी पड़ती। जैसे वो अल्लाह परफेक्ट है, गॉड जी परफेक्ट है, हमें ऐसे परफेक्शन चाहिए ही नहीं, बिकॉज it's a fake perfection. It's a fake perfection that demands slavery. So please don't think that I'm trying to be an apologist who wants to paint everything about pre-Islamic society as being perfect. No, Mahabharata tells you life was not perfect. There was plenty of strife even at that time. रामायण में भी तो स्ट्राइफ है, ऐसा नहीं परफेक्ट हार्मनी में, वहां भी राक्षस होते थे जो ऋषियों की तपस्या में भंग करने आते थे। बहुत कहीं भी ऐसा नहीं कि life has been all peaceful, all calm, everybody has been equal. राम और रावण कभी इक्वल नहीं हो सकते ना, और ऋषि और राक्षस इक्वल नहीं हो सकते ना, तो क्यों हो भी क्यों? सबको अपनी लेवल ढूंढने की क्षमता होनी चाहिए। एंड एवरी सोसाइटी, अ गुड सोसाइटी इज वन दैट नोज हाउ टू कॉम्बैट wrongdoers, that knows how to swiftly punish wrongdoers, जो दूसरों का हक हनन करते हैं, अधिकार हनन करते हैं, उनको जल्द से जल्द कड़ी से कड़ी सजा मिले, तो तभी समाज में न्याय व्यवस्था बन पाती है। और उस दिशा में हमें काम करना है, ना कि वाइट वॉश करना है अपने पास्ट को, हमें जरूरत नहीं है, क्योंकि बहुत बाकी दुनिया के समाजों से कई बेहतरीन समाज हमने देखे हैं, और हमारे पूर्वजों ने जो ज्ञान परंपराएं शुरू की है, परफेक्ट तो नहीं कोई भी कह सकता, परंतु दे आर फार बेटर देन एनीथिंग हैंडेड डाउन टू अस बाय वेस्टर्न ज्ञान परंपरा, which is very parasitical and predatory. The whole Western civilization is a predatory civilization, which ours was not. So with these words, I take your leave. Shubhratri, Vande Mataram. Please do share, like, and subscribe to this channel. Namaste.